All right, can everyone see that?
Yes, that's clear.
Great, great. So thank you all for coming, and thank you to Sihar and Sawfish Project Indonesia for hosting this. And I hope that I can give you a little bit of new information about sawfish during the next 45 minutes or so. And as Sihar says, I'll be happy to answer any questions if I can after the talk. So just a little bit about me. Yeah, as Sihar mentioned, I'm actually not a marine biologist, but my educational background is actually in archaeology and anthropology, the study of human cultures around the world, either by talking to the people or if the people are an ancient society by looking at their remains. And I also have, of course, a degree in law, which is what I actually do, Saya Pangacara. And so what I actually study is the cultural importance of animals around the world. And I do spend a lot of my time looking at sawfish, and recently now also looking at one of their relatives, another ray, the wedge fish, which is Ikan hiu kamajan. And what is cultural importance? Well, it could encompass anything from art to symbolism to trade to the different uses people make of animals and what they think about them. So for instance, this here is an Aboriginal painting from Australia of a totemic sawfish where a certain tribe in an area believes that their land was created by a sawfish who opened up a giant river by carving it out with his saw. So to start with sawfish, what is a sawfish? Well, sawfish is a type of ray, and a ray is just a type of cartilaginous fish that also includes sharks and other types of rays. And so a ray is basically essentially a flattened shark that has been evolved to life sitting on the bottom. And so it's got certain characteristics to help it in that lifestyle. It's flat on the bottom, and you can tell a ray from a shark, even though some of them look similar, because rays always have the gill slits where they exhale on the bottom. And so you can see here, we have the gill slits on the underside of the animal. And here, this is a specimen that had been dissected, and you can see some of the internal organs, including the intestines, the liver, and these giant things that are the size of grapefruits or a softball. Those are actually eggs. Those are ova that the young will develop from. And they're some of the largest in the animal kingdom. This, incidentally, is a beautiful dwarf sawfish, one of the rarest species, and they do occur or used to occur in Indonesia and Malaysia, and they have a beautiful color. So where did the rays come from? Well, there was early sharks 400 million years ago, and some of them went a different direction and started adapting to life on the bottom, and they became flatter. And this is similar to our modern guitarfish, and sawfish is developed out of that guitarfish line. So they're related to guitarfish and wedgefish. And then other rays became even more specialized and lost the tail that would propel them and started using their disc, the pectoral fins that were expanded to move. And some of those even came off the bottom and became what are the manta rays and the eagle rays. So sawfishes are rays, and they're specialized rays, but they branched off as sharks earlier than some other rays, and that's why they look more like a shark. Indonesia is special because it has 4 of the 5 species in the world, and each of them are unique and have a different lifestyle and habitat. We don't understand a lot of the parameters of their lifestyles to know what particular habitat requirements the different species might need. Certainly the freshwater sawfish needs rivers and lakes to rear its young in certain areas. But some of the other species, we're not 100% sure about their life history. We don't know why, for instance, the green sawfish has an extremely long saw relative to its body size versus a very short saw for the dwarf sawfish. There's probably some functional reason for that, but that's still an unknown. But Indonesia is a special place because it has all of the species in the Pacific available in its waters. So if we look at the anatomy of a sawfish, it's a ray, so it has specialized features, these holes on the top that are called spiracles, and they're just special holes for them to inhale water through when they breathe, because if they're sitting in the mud or the sand on the bottom, if they try to inhale through the mouth, they would just get a mouthful of silt and sand, and that would clog up their gills. So they actually rays breathe through the top through these special holes called spiracles. It's got eyes, and their eyes work fine, but they're small compared to its body size, and that tells us that eyesight is not particularly important for them. And a lot of sawfish live in very murky, turbid water, and they operate more at night than during the day, so eyesight is not as prominent as some other senses. And of course, the most interesting feature on a sawfish is the long, hard saw with the teeth sticking out the sides of it, and it's got several uses. The sawfish is a sensory tool that allows it to find prey and understand its surroundings, and it's also a tool for them to subdue prey. So we'll look at that. So there have been studies in the last few decades that have figured out that there are a battery of sensory pores along the saw on both sides and around the head of sawfish. And one system is called the lateral line, and these are the ones that form these lines. And those are motion sensors. They can sense about 100 meters out the movement of prey or predators or currents, and that allows them to understand their surroundings even when it's dark and even when the water is muddy. And they've also got these scattered pores all over the saw on both sides that are called ampullae of Lorenzini, and they're actually electrosensors, and they feel the prey or predator's heartbeats and muscle movements, the electrical signals that are made when they move. And so they can find prey in muddy water, murky water, or at night. And the ampullae of Lorenzini, the electrical sensors, they work about 50 centimeters out from what experiments tell us. So this is the knife-tooth sawfish, and it just shows the lateral line as well as the ampullae of Lorenzini on top of the head. And this is actually a picture I took of a sawfish saw in Lake Nicaragua and then modified it so I could highlight the pores. So here's the lateral lines along the side of the underside of the saw, and then all these scattered ones are the electrosensors. So it's almost like a metal detector as it goes across the substrate, so it can find its prey by sensing electrical signals and movement. So the saw also, aside from being a interesting sensory device for the sawfish, is also used to subdue its prey. And what it does is it swings the saw when it finds a fish or a cuttlefish or some other animal that it wants to eat, and it swings it really fast and hits it and stuns it. And then if it's near the bottom or here in an aquarium, as the prey stunned falls down, it'll pin it to the ground with its saw and then roll it all the way to the mouth. So if it wakes up or isn't exactly dead, it can't swim away, they'll just roll it by pressing it all the way to the mouth. And then the saw is also useful to a sawfish because, of course, it can hit things that try to attack it. And these are usually things like crocodiles or sharks that will try to eat, especially a small sawfish, and they will hit an animal with it. And the way it hits is extremely fast. I've seen it at the Baltimore Aquarium. I was with one of the aquarists there years ago, and they were trying to pull up one of their sawfish that had an injury so they could treat it. And they had ropes around its saw, ropes around its tail, and then someone dropped a rope and the saw started swinging, and we're all on a raised metal gangplank just above the shark tank, and it starts hitting the gangplank side with tremendous force really quickly, and it was momentarily quite frightening and reminded me of an alien movie. But so they do use it for defense, but they're not dangerous to people. I've never found one instance of someone seriously injured by a sawfish, although people have been smacked trying to pull them into boats, but they just get small puncture holes. And here we see, for instance, a crocodile that actually got a sawfish, a juvenile sawfish in a river in northern Australia. So they are eaten by sharks and crocodiles and other large predators from time to time. And so they do use the saw as a defensive weapon. Life history-wise, we're still learning about them, but most of them are born about 60 centimeters in length. They mature at about 3 meters in length. Their maximum size reaches over 7 meters, which is insanely large, but they rarely are found at that size anymore. And only some species get that big. They mature and can reproduce in about 10 years. The average lifespan might be around 30 to 40 years, but we're sort of unclear about that. They appear to mate maybe every 2 years, and they only have about 8 young on average. So all these characteristics mean that they're very slow growing and slow maturing animals, and they have very few young compared to, say, normal bony fishes. And so that means that they can be very vulnerable to exploitation. If you remove a lot of sawfishes from a habitat, they will take a very long time, decades, to recover. And if there's fishing pressure, nets in the water, they probably won't repopulate. Now, that incidentally was a picture from the Sepik River in Papua New Guinea. A young sawfish caught there. So historically, sawfishes were found in 92 countries, and this is a map showing the historic distribution as we understand it. You can see from where the sawfish occur that they're primarily tropical animals. We don't see them in temperate regions. Sawfishes started disappearing dramatically somewhere about 50, 60 years ago and ongoing. And now, from 92 countries, only 24 countries are now reporting sawfish being found ever recently, which means that sawfish's range has decreased by about 81%. And the actual population, the number of sawfish we have today versus the number of sawfish maybe 60 years ago, is probably down by 95%. So right now, we only have 5% of the population of sawfish that used to exist even several generations ago. So a lot of sawfishes used to be common in certain areas of the world, and in many countries, fishermen have never even heard of them because they just don't see them anymore. And some fishermen say they haven't seen them in 20 to 50 years. So what do sawfish eat? Well, the young eat a variety of things. They'll eat small fish as well as small invertebrates like crabs and shrimps. As adults, most of them eat a variety of schooling fish like mullet and herring. They'll also eat things like squid or cuttlefish. And again, they smack them with the saw. Habitat for young is very important for sawfish because if the young don't have a secure place to grow up, they won't grow up. Sawfishes use segregating techniques in order to avoid predators. So sawfishes, depending on the species, will either have their young spend their first years in the prop roots of mangroves. For some species, some they just would occur in very, very shallow water, so shallow that sharks or big crocodiles wouldn't be able to get in. So they spend multiple years in these very shallow habitats. You also have freshwater sawfish spending time in rivers and certain lakes around the world for the same reasons. And again, if they're not careful, they do get eaten by other animals or, of course, eaten by people. So looking at freshwater, we can look at the literature and reports, and we can see that there's a variety of mostly rivers, but of course one lake. We have Danau Sentani in Papua province. And so these are rivers that historically hosted populations of the freshwater sawfish Pristis pristis. And of course, this is where the young would spend their first years. The big adults would come into the river estuaries, the river mouths, and they would give birth. And then the young would navigate upstream and they would stay in the rivers for several years. And then they would come out and they would be in the ocean as adults, and they would come back to rivers to spawn themselves and have their own babies. And so you can see, for instance, that the Strait of Malacca was an important place for sawfish. There was at least 4 rivers that had sawfish populations using them for freshwater sawfish nursery areas. And these are areas that, of course, nowadays have a lot of fishing pressure. And so it's a bad time for sawfish in this area. They get caught frequently. For instance, here's a juvenile sawfish that was caught in Riau just a few years ago. And this is a juvenile sawfish that must have come out of one of the rivers there. And then here's a large adult, again, probably coming into the area to mate or give birth. And we also have it in Kalimantan and, of course, in Sarawak and Sabah, different rivers. And there's undoubtedly other rivers that sawfishes use, but these are the ones we know about. If you interviewed fishermen, from different river systems throughout Indonesia, older fishermen, you might find evidence that sawfish used to be in a lot more rivers than this. But at least these rivers, sawfishes are found in. And we don't know yet exactly why some rivers host sawfish and others don't. There's certainly some biological factor that makes some rivers attractive to sawfish and others not. And we'll talk about Sungai Mahakam later in the talk. And of course, here is near Merauke. We've had, both large-toothed sawfish and knife-toothed sawfish and Oxypristis caught there in recent years. We see sawfish rarely in Indonesia caught. I've seen, a few records a year. So they're rare, but they're still there. And of course, we don't hear about all the captures. Let's talk about threats. So a major threat to sawfish is fishing catch. And of course, fishing catch can come in lots of different ways. There's recreational fishers, people fishing for fun. There's food fishing, people in local communities that fish and to get food for their families, or maybe to sell to the local community. There's a lot of women in Indonesia and Malaysia that have home businesses, and they'll sell freshly prepared foods and freshly caught fish to the neighborhood, posting on social media. There's also, of course, commercial fishing. You have people that go in and have big operations to catch especially sharks for a variety of purposes, including shark fin. And that can be very profitable. And you'll even have people coming into Indonesia from countries like Thailand and China and Vietnam and the Philippines to illegally fish, because Indonesia hosts a very, extensive fishing grounds with a lot of sharks, and there's a lot of people there that want to make money. And of course, there is accidental capture, which is bycatch, where people might be fishing with nets for other species, not hoping to catch sawfish, but they might catch a lot of sawfish anyway. And that has been a major point of why sawfish has declined all over the world so drastically, is accidental catch in nets. There was a lot of nets when that went in the water when cheap monofilament gill nets became available. And once you see those being used in a country on a wide scale, you see sawfish populations plummet. And you can even see, if those nets became popular in Florida in the 1950s, we see the populations crash that same year. And so, for instance, here we see a boat from Florida in America, somewhere in the early 1900s. And I've tried to count, it looks like there's at least 33 sawfish hanging here from one expedition. I don't know if it was a netting operation or sport fishing or something, probably a net with how many sawfishes they caught. But you can see one boat operating in one expedition can catch a huge amount of sawfish. And you can imagine moving that amount of sawfish out of a habitat, out of an area, might make it very hard for the sawfish to remain in that area with other fishing pressure. This, incidentally, is from Indonesia. It's a large green sawfish rostrum. This is from the Red Sea, green sawfish babies from Sudan. So this is an older map, but it's useful for us. You can see sawfish are in trouble. They're in trouble all the areas they used to be common for the most part, except two. Northern Australia and the southern tip of Florida are doing comparatively well. And you can see Indonesia and Southeast Asia in general has a very high fishing pressure. There's a lot of people fishing, a lot of nets in the water, and that makes it very dangerous for sawfish, because sawfish are particularly vulnerable to nets given their saw. So why do some reasons or some areas do better? Like, why is Northern Australia doing better, and why is the southern tip of Florida doing better with their sawfish populations? Well, it's easy. The comparison is because this area, the southern tip of Florida, is a lot less populated than other areas. For instance, the whole southern tip basically is a national park in America that has protections where there can't be any net fishing within the protected area, and there's only limited sport fishing. And so sawfishes have been able to, in recent decades, to give birth and raise their young in the mangroves in southern Florida. And then these animals can then move out of the protected area. And even though they might be caught farther north, there's always this core that is protected where the babies can grow and live and be free from commercial fishing and free from net fishing. And the same sort of thing happens in Australia. The northern coasts of Australia are very sparsely populated. The biggest city only has about 138,000 people in it. They've got very highly regulated fisheries, and the fishermen are trained to release sawfish, and they've got very limited net fishing allowed at all. So they only have a handful of nets in the water at a time, compared to Indonesia, which has, and Malaysia and Southeast Asia, which has a very high fishing pressure comparatively. And that's why it's going to be difficult. to conserve sawfishes without some significant changes, although you can see some areas are not as bad. For instance, Provinsi Papua is not as bad as some of the other areas. For instance, there's a lot of high fishing pressure in the west, but if you look in the east, it's less. And if we can set up protected areas, for instance, where sawfishes live in Provinsi Papua, that would be very useful and helpful to sawfish. Another threat that existed, particularly in Sumatra, is there was, from the 1980s through at least the 1990s, a small aquarium trade operating out of two rivers in Sumatra, particularly the Indragiri River and the Batanghari. There were fishermen who would net sawfishes in these rivers, and they would sell them to private aquarium owners in homes and businesses, and also public aquaria. And I found shipments to America, to Singapore, to Taiwan, to Japan, and even Germany. The price was almost 75,000 rupiah, or about 5,000 American dollars each. And this trade crashed about 2000 because they couldn't catch sawfishes to meet their orders. Their sawfishes were gone in these rivers to the point where they couldn't predict that they could catch enough for their customers. So last I heard, this trade has sort of dried up. There was a brief aquarium trade for animals taken from Sumatra. Another threat for sawfish, and this is a major one, is accidental catch or intentional catch in nets. Sawfish saws with the teeth, you couldn't design an object that would be more likely to be caught in a net. And so even if you're trying not to catch a sawfish, fishermen who fish where sawfish are, if sawfish are there, they'll get caught in the net, and you have to cut them out, and it can be a little bit dangerous, and a lot of fishermen don't like dealing with them, and they can do a lot of damage. This was a fishing net in northern Australia where they were not fishing for sawfish, but they ended up catching dozens of baby sawfish in a nursery area. These are knife-toothed sawfish and Noxopristis. And here's another picture from Australia where fishermen, again, not trying to catch a sawfish. Sawfish are protected in Australia, but caught a huge, large tooth sawfish, Pristis pristis, had to cut it out of their net. Here's a green sawfish caught in a net in Australia. This is an actual research net. But so even if a fisherman is not trying to catch sawfish, nets in the water will kill sawfish because sawfishes are so easily caught if they touch a net. What's interesting is this vulnerability to sawfish has been well known even to ancient cultures. I found a proverb in Central Africa that's hundreds of years old and probably older that read, "The sawfish's saw killed the sawfish," because they recognize that if there's a net in the water and a sawfish hits it, it's not getting out and it will die. And they use this proverb whenever someone engages in some activity and they're really motivated to engage in it, but then it ends up killing them. And so it's some sort of single-minded obsession that leads to someone's death. They compare it to a sawfish having its own saw, that it's its means of gaining a living by eating, but it's also the means where it will die if it touches a net. And I thought that was interesting. So another major threat to sawfish is loss of habitat. Sawfish babies particularly need special habitats. Like I mentioned, they need the mangroves. Some species, most species need mangroves so they can hide the babies in the roots and have habitat to protect them from predators. Other species just need very shallow waters, whether just in bays or river mouths or shallows. And of course, in a lot of areas of the world, a lot of these mangrove forests at the edges of water bodies, bays and estuaries, are being cut down, and they're cut down for various reasons. Some countries cut them down to make rice paddies. Some countries cut them down for firewood or for building material. Some countries cut them down so they can set up aquaculture, so they can raise food fish or shrimps or things like that. So that's something that if you cut down the mangroves are lost. You're going to lose the sawfishes that used to breed there and raise their young. You're going to lose the nursery areas. And then, of course, another major problem is that a lot of coastal areas get developed. Humans like to live on the beach or on the coast. They like to have amenities like hotels and roads and restaurants and water activities like boating and such. And so you get a lot of development. For instance, here is Dubai in the Persian Gulf. And this area, prior to all this development, used to have certain creeks that there used to be sawfish babies in. It was reported in a lot of the early literature. And of course, Dubai has become incredibly developed. It's a very rich area, and they've been very developed in the coast. They've made artificial islands. They're beautiful, and it's an incredible place to go. But the sawfish are gone. They've modified the habitat so much that the areas the sawfishes need are no longer there. They dredged the creek so that boats could go up them, bigger boats. They modified the habitat so that the sawfishes have disappeared. So habitat modification is a problem. We also see, pollution and overfishing, making the habitat unsuitable for sawfish. Here's something I study with my cultural studies, and that's the shark fin trade. And it's not well known, and the studies on it are not particularly detailed yet. But in my studies, it's very clear that sawfishes are one of the highest priced fins in the shark fin trade. And this is a big problem because there's a huge motivation for fishermen to catch sawfishes and also related rays like the wedgefish, the ikan kamajan, because they have very, very high value fins. And in fact, individual species have different trade names. So here's actually, these are trader photographs, and they've got the trade names on them. This is huangjiao, means yellow glue, and these are Pristis genus fins. And they're called that because the fins are sort of yellowish color, and glue because when you make the shark fin soup, what they look for is these noodles that are the ceratotrichia that run through the fins for support, and they process them and boil them, and they become these luxuriant textured noodles basically. And the sawfish fins, the wedgefish fins are particularly important for this trade because they make the best quality. It's been said to me by a trader, these are the caviar of shark fin, the sawfish and the wedgefish. So they're very high value. And so these are trader photographs where they are offering for sale these fins because they're very high value. And here's actually an Indonesian trade name used by fishermen for a Noxopristis. Noxopristis is called in Chinese mianchurin, and it's called in the Indonesian trade name pancas. And what's fascinating is sawfish were targeted for their fins by the Chinese and the fishermen feeding the Chinese trade really early on. So here's, for instance, a quote from 1809 from a traveler in the Red Sea who came across an island off Eritrea and found a huge pile of sawfish rostra lying in a valley and asked the people what they were for. And he said, oh, the fishermen here catch sawfish for their fins because it's a large article to export to India, so it can be exported to China where they make it into a soup. And this is, it gives glutinous richness to soup. It makes it, rich and thick and taste good. And so the Chinese fishermen, or the fishermen, that worked for the Chinese, were already going really far away from China to get sawfish, probably because the sawfish had already been depleted back in 1809. They were already going to areas as far afield as the Red Sea looking for sawfish. This is part of a catalog of a shark fin trader in China. And these are the really high value fins, and they're all those rays that look like sharks. Glaucostegus, these are ikan parihu. And this is sawfish. This is Pristis genus sawfish, the huangjiao fin. This is Rhynchobatus, ikan kamajan, and rhina. And these are still very high value fins, and when fishermen catch them who know about the Chinese shark fin market, they sell the fins because they're the most expensive fins in all the shark fins. So when they're catching sharks and processing shark fins, they'll jumble all the sharks together because the sharks are not the high value fins. Those are the medium value fins. But they'll separately store the rays, the sawfish, the Glaucostegus guitarfish, and the kamajan shovel-nosed rays, because these are the high value caviar of shark fin. And they're still catching sharks, sawfish in Indonesia and Malaysia occasionally, and they are of course saving the really high value fins to sell. So for instance, here's a catch from just a few years ago in Sumatra. Here is a seizure by the police in Jayapura in Papua, when they had the fins separated in category, and of course sawfish fins are going to be separate because they're high value, and they give them particularly to traders, separate from the other fins. And this is particularly, these are Anoxopristis fins, but they've got, they've got the Indonesian name here, Hiu Gergaji. And this is, I'm not sure when it's from, in the past few decades, in somewhere in Malaysia, probably Sarawak, a huge large tooth sawfish. Again, fins are being processed because they're really, really high value. So this is something to look out for. This is a big danger for sawfish because their fins are so high value that fishermen are still going to want to catch them who know about them. Another less expensive use is meat. And of course, when people catch sawfish all over the world, local people will eat the meat because they have a lot of meat often, and they're huge. And it's not the best meat in the world, but it's good, and people will use it. And so that's another reason that people catch sawfish. So this is from Sarawak, and of course this is from this is actually the Sepik area in Papua New Guinea. And another lesser commercially expensive item is curios, basically souvenirs, where people, when they catch a sawfish are amazing. People love the saw, and it's people all over the world have saved the saws from sawfish that they catch, and they hang them in their house, or they paint them, or some people use them for art or weapons. And so, for instance, here's a large green sawfish, Pristis Zeiseron. Here's freshwater sawfishes in an Indonesian home. Here's a souvenir saw where someone has beautifully painted it, and this is when it came from Dobo in Maluku. And so sometimes saws can give us information about where animals were caught. I look at saws because usually when you see a saw somewhere, the saw was usually caught locally if it's in an area where sawfish exist. So this might tell you, historically where sawfish of different species used to be. So for instance, we know that they can catch freshwater sawfish, the Pristis, in the Malukus. I look at cultural information, and I came across this a few years ago and really liked it. This is a story that comes from Kalimantan, and it comes from a text about a time somewhere around 1600 AD, 400 years ago. And it talks about two Islamic teachers that they both reportedly came from Sumatra, but they were at the time in Sulawesi teaching Islam to local people. And they heard that there was a Hindu kingdom in Kalimantan called Kutai. And so they left Sulawesi to tell the people in Kutai about their faith. And one guy came in a boat, and the other guy, amazingly, to the people of Kutai who saw them arriving on the coast, came riding on the back of a giant sawfish. And so the people of Kutai in their texts call him Tuan Tunggung Parangan, Sir riding a sawfish. And Parangan, incidentally, is still a name in at least northern Borneo, in Sabah and parts of Sarawak, for sawfish. They still call them that. So there's this story that this teacher named Tuan Tunggung Parangan arrived at the kingdom of Kutai, and he met the king of this Hindu kingdom, who was called Raja Mahkota. And Raja Mahkota said, hey, I'm interested that you rode this giant shark when you arrived. What would you like to tell us? And he said, well, I know of this faith that is better than what you're doing now, and I will prove to you that it is a superior faith and that you should follow our ways. And he said, well, I like what you're saying, but I want you to prove that what you're saying is true. And so he made several tests for Tuan Tunggung Parangan. The first one was he, through the magic of his Hindu faith, was able to make himself invisible, and then had Tuan Tunggung Parangan try to find him. And of course, Tuan Tunggung Parangan prayed and purified himself and was able to walk right over and grab him. where he was, even though he was invisible. And I said, very, very good, but this test you'll never pass. And what the king did is he used his magic and created a giant magical fire along the coast and said, you need to put this out if you need to prove to me that your faith is better than what we're doing and that you have powers that we don't. And so Tuan Tunggung Padangan purified himself, prayed 2 times, and summoned a giant rainstorm. And it rained really, really hard all over Kutai and flooded the entire kingdom, but the magical fire didn't go out. So the king mocked him and said, hey, it looks like, your faith is not as strong as mine. And he said, just give me a moment. And he said, hey, shark, and called his sawfish that appeared in the river right there in the Kutai kingdom. And he said, swim back and forth and put out that fire. And so his huge freshwater sawfish swam up and down the river as fast as it could and made a giant wake that then drenched the fire and put it out. And then King Makota had to admit that he had been beaten and that he and his entire kingdom would convert to Islam because it was the true faith as proven by the miracles of the sawfish. And so I thought this was a fantastic story. And so I just wanted to let you know about this because this is the sort of important cultural moment that can give a personality to sawfish. That if you can find ways that sawfish were important in different areas of Indonesia, that can be an important way to engage with people. There is, for instance, in the area of Kutai now, there is a shrine for the 2 teachers that came from Sulawesi 400 years ago, and you can actually find the shrine of Tuan Tunggung Padangan. And wouldn't it be interesting to talk to the people there about what they know, or have some sort of sawfish outreach program there? And that's the sort of story that I think will make sawfish more important to people who may not have heard of them or know much about them. And of course, sawfish have, I'm sure they have importance culturally in other areas. I've certainly found metal-covered saws in Madura, in Java, and in Papua, both in Provinsi Papua and also in Papua New Guinea. Sawfish are very important to a lot of coastal and river cultures. They're seen as powerful spirits. In the Sepik, for instance, they believe that sawfishes are spirits, and if you hurt them or mistreat them, they will cause huge rainstorms that can cause floods or damage people's homes or crops. And so here we see an array of art from, this is a totemic post from the Sepik River, where there's certain clans in the Yatmo people that believe that they were founded by a sawfish ancestor. And so they depict him. And this is a Maro cloth from Danau Sentani, which they make, or they formerly made beautiful cloth panels and carvings with the sawfishes that are found in Danau Sentani. And you can see this sawfish is even hitting a fish with a saw, it looks like, which is interesting. And so these are other, animals that would inhabit the lake. This is another Iatmol painted saw from a freshwater sawfish. But certainly we see sawfish art from the Osmont region. We see sawfish art from the Comoro region. Pretty much most of the coastal areas that have high populations of Papuan people, they have some sort of sawfish legends and art, and they're pretty interesting. Here's a modern soccer team logo from Jayapura depicting the Lake Sentani sawfish. And so it would be interesting to, if you're in Papua, to talk to these different people and learn about what sawfish mean to them and what sort of art they might have. And so I'll end with just reiterating what the points are about what would be the best ways to address sawfish populations in Indonesia to try to assure that sawfishes continue to be there and maybe do better. And of course, one of the major things we'd want to do is we want to ban net fishing in sawfish habitats where possible. We want areas with the mangroves, we want areas around river mouths protected from net fishing. And just like we saw in Florida and just like we saw in Northern Australia, healthy sawfish populations can't exist unless you've got protected areas where the babies can grow and then move out. So we need protected habitat, especially juvenile habitat in areas. We need to decrease the net fishing in rivers, so maybe the sawfishes would come back to Sumatra in more numbers. for instance, or in Papua. It would be very important and good if we could greatly reduce or ban the shark fin trade. The shark fin trade is just feeding a Chinese cuisine need, and it's a very high value trade, and it's such a high value item that it's going to continue to motivate fishermen to catch and retain sawfish and cut their fins off, because they're worth so much money. Again, they can be thousands of dollars just for one set of high value fins from certain species of sawfish. So shark fin trade would be, a major win if we could get shark fin trade reduced or even banned in Indonesia, so that fishermen wouldn't be retaining sawfish to remove their fins. That would be very helpful. We'd like to see the restoration of mangroves and rivers and lakes, address issues of pollution, of erosion, of, clear cutting of forests that leads to soil being dumped into the river when it rains heavily, toxins going in from mining and other, agricultural uses that pollute rivers. So we can clear up, again, habitats that are needed for sawfish so that they can return and flourish. And also importantly, it would be very good to educate people about sawfish. This has been very helpful in Florida and Northern Australia, where they educate fishermen and people on the coast about sawfish, that sawfish are important, that we want them, that fishermen should release them from their nets and keep them safe instead of killing them. And teaching fishermen how to do that safely. And also, if possible, governments in Australia have had luck actually incentivizing fishermen to release sawfish. Sometimes they give them money for releasing a sawfish, so then it will hopefully take away that monetary incentive to keep them. And of course, you'd need laws to protect sawfish, and more importantly, that those laws actually be enforced, which is a problem in a lot of countries. And again, I'll reiterate that Papua is a very good place for sawfishes right now. Certainly in Papua New Guinea, sawfish populations are doing reasonably well, and if Provinsi Papua could conserve sawfish populations and set up protected areas for them, that could continue to be an area where sawfishes do well and can remain strong. And so I will end there, and I will be happy to answer any questions anyone might have.
Okay, thank you so much, Matthew, for the presentation. It's really great information there. Some very good insights. I don't even know about the pancake in Indonesia. Haven't heard before, and about Tuan Tunggang Parangan.
Yeah.
That's pretty new for me. Very, very cool. Yeah, in fact, it's quite interesting that you use Indonesian language in your presentation materials, but you use English when it comes to explain them. So thank you for the presentations.
Of course.
And I've been watching the chat box, and we have some questions for you, Matthew.
Sure.
Perhaps people have been waiting for this moment, and yeah, here we go. We have the first question, which is from Karetno. Karetno, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question directly?
No, thank you. You can.
No.
Yeah.
All right, I can ask them for you. So Matthew, Karetno is asking, what could fishermen possibly do when they found sawfish bycatch within their net? How to mitigate it?
How can they get them out? I'm sorry, was the question how to remove them from the net?
What could fishermen possibly do when they found sawfish bycatch within their net? How to mitigate it?
There's different tools that people use. There's a thing called a net hook that can help untangle a sawfish. Of course, what you would do is try to secure the tail and then try to untangle the saw and keep it in the water so that the animal can breathe, because of course they breathe water through their gills, so you need to keep the head underwater. And this can be hard because they can get very tangled in nets, they can get really wrapped up, and often fishermen end up just having to cut them. Cut the animal out with scissors or a knife, just being careful not to hurt the animal. And of course, this can be a problem for some fishermen, because of course nets can be very expensive and they don't want to hurt their nets. But the reality is, if you did catch a sawfish, you can't if you can't untangle it readily, then you will probably have to cut the net to get it out. Unfortunately, a lot of fishermen decide to kill the sawfish to make it less dangerous. But if you secure the animal, it often can be released without damage to the sawfish and without too much danger to the fishermen.
All right. The next question comes from Nugraha. Does sawfish have a vulnerability to live at certain temperatures?
Do they have temperatures that they need to survive?
Yes. That's
Yeah, they're tropical animals. So certainly the extremes at both ends can kill them. Certainly in Australia, when we see sawfishes that are trapped in shrinking rivers when it gets really hot, if the temperature gets too high in the rivers, they will die. And we had a huge die-off a few years ago in a farm in Western Australia where a bunch of sawfishes got trapped in a pool when the river dried up some, and they died from either low oxygen or the temperature. And they also get killed the other way if it gets too cold, like in southern Florida. It's usually pretty warm, but every once in a while in a winter, it can get really cold. And if it gets below, I think it was maybe if it gets into the 40s Fahrenheit, it can kill sawfishes as well. So yeah, there is definitely a temperature range that sawfishes need, and it's commensurate with tropical water temperatures.
okay, Matthew. I think Retno is asking again to continue the previous question he had before. Is there any technique to mitigate the potential of sawfish bycatch?
Not that I've heard of, because with the saw, it makes it really difficult. Like there are excluding devices that work well for some fish and sea turtles because they don't have something on them that is so apt to get caught in a net. The problem with a sawfish is you really couldn't design an object that would be more apt to be caught in a net than a sawfish rostrum. And so it makes it very hard to get them contacting a net and not be caught in it. So there might be something, I just have never heard of anything that is useful to keep them out of the net, aside from keeping nets out of where sawfishes are.
Okay. Retno, is it clear, or are you asking more questions? Do you need
No,
some more information?
it's clear. I think there's a possibility, but maybe the research has not been done because sawfish also have like the sensory, like shark, and shark maybe to keep them out. I don't know. Maybe there is any research that to keep them sawfish out using the sensory tools. Maybe.
Yeah, I've never heard of something, but that's an interesting idea that maybe there's something that would irritate their electrosensors or something that maybe they would stay away from the area. But I've never heard of research on that angle, but that certainly sounds interesting.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay, Matthew, we have another questions from Iqbal. Iqbal thought that you've done some field trip to investigate the sawfish, and he's asking how many individuals that you found during the field trip session. Any information about the most area or habitat where they found? Which one? Estuary, marine, or freshwater?
I've only done 2 expeditions into sawfish habitat. I did a trip with some shark scientists in southern Florida, and then I also did a trip for a summer in Lake Nicaragua in the freshwater sawfish. And in both of those areas, during the time that I went, sawfish populations were really, really low, and I didn't actually see any live sawfish during my trips at all. I did collect saws when I was in Lake Nicaragua, and certainly sawfish were caught in Lake Nicaragua a couple times a year, but they had been so overfished for the shark fin trade and for local meat use in the 1970s that the lake that used to have thousands and thousands of sawfish had been just reduced to just a few. But I did interview fishermen who had been sawfish fishermen in the 70s, and they said, yeah, there were so many of them, they would catch 5 at a time if you put a net out. And then nowadays, he only caught, it was, maybe 1 or 2 a year, because once the sawfish disappeared, they were still fishing with nets for other species like tarpon and other food fish. So anytime there were sawfish, they were still getting caught in the net. So they never had a chance to come back, because their period to replace their population is so long that they never had a chance, because there were still so many nets in the water. So I've actually never seen a sawfish in the wild.
Right. Thank you, Matthew. And the next question comes from World Oceanist Argentina. Have you got any experience using environmental DNA in Indonesia?
eDNA?
Yeah, eDNA.
No, I know people, fish biologists who use that, and they've used it in countries like Mexico and such to determine whether sawfish are still present in coasts and rivers and such there, and in other areas of the world. But I personally don't actually work with, fisheries projects directly like that, so I haven't done it.
Yep. Okay. Jason wondering, are the pectoral fins also used for making shark fin dishes?
Yes, that's a good question. I'm sorry, not the pectoral fins. Both dorsal fins are used and the tail, but the pectoral fins are not. Although some fishermen who catch them cut them off anyway because they think they might be used. But no, only the 2 dorsal fins and the tail have the ceratotrichia that they use in the shark fin dish. They're like stiffening fibers that's what they actually extract from the fin.
Okay, Matthew, we have some questions that have been submitted when they registered. The first one is, what is the role of sawfish in aquatic ecology? Does the introduction of sawfish to Indonesia have a negative impact on other creatures?
Well, sawfish were indigenous to Indonesia, and they had all 4 species from the Pacific there. So they are part of the ecosystem to begin with, and their absence is probably having negative effects. Actually, the ecology of rays in general is very poorly understood at this point. What sort of effects they have on other animals and plants, and the makeup of the bottom of lakes and rivers and coastlines and bays and such. So they probably do have some important role. We just haven't identified what that is yet. But sawfish were always part of the habitat in Indonesia and Malaysia and Southeast Asia. And just in recent decades, they've disappeared. So in fact, that is a loss. So they wouldn't actually have any negative impact that I'm aware of. They're supposed to be there.
Okay, Matthew, here's another question. Do you know myths, tales, or any kind of popular legends about sawfish? But I think you got this covered, right?
Yeah, I know lots of stories about sawfish and art, myths, and such from all over the world. That's mostly what I study, is the cultural importance of sawfish in cultures all over the world. And I also do that for wedgefish, which are the ikan hiu kamajan. And so sawfish have been very important in a lot of coastal cultures in the tropics and riverine cultures. And yeah, so actually my whole house is filled with art I've collected from all over the world of sawfish.
Okay, we got another question from Retno. Matthew, is there any publication of sawfish habitat in Indonesia? If any, has it been proposed to make the MPA, marine protected areas, or any local restriction or policy of the use of net for fishing?
Not that I've heard of. I would hope that in the future, people start looking to protect certain habitats in certain areas as protected areas to help sawfish and other animals that use those same areas. Because I think that our data from the few areas that have successfully returned sawfish to decent populations show that that's really the only way to do it. You have to have protected areas where the young can grow up and expand from, where there's not net fishing, where there's not commercial fishing, so that you have safe areas for the young sawfish. And hopefully we can see sawfishes rebound in at least certain areas of Indonesia.
Yeah. We have a baseline question here. Why sawfish is really important?
Well, they're one of a lot of species that are important. Obviously, we'd like to see lots of animals, safe in Southeast Asia, like, the tigers and cassowaries and sawfish and, you know, rhinos and all those things that we have available in these areas that are, I think they, to me at least, I think it's a cultural value. I think that some people argue, who cares if the tigers are gone from Sumatra and the rhinos and the sawfish? But I would say that it makes an area, a country, or an island more interesting to have amazing animals there. And I think that for some people, they may not care. Who cares if the sawfish are gone? Who cares if the tigers go extinct? But I think it makes it a more interesting place to live and an interesting place to visit. And it makes it a more exotic and interesting place to have unique fauna. So I think that animals have a right to, to live where they're supposed to live. And I think that it's interesting to see those animals and know that they're there. And I personally think that that alone is a value that should be respected.
Okay, Matthew. The next question is sawfish dangerous for human? I think many wonder about this one.
No, they look like they should be dangerous, but they're not. They can be enormous, and they've got the big toothy saw. And they look like they would be extremely dangerous, but they're not. I've looked all over the world, and I've talked to people all over the world, and I've never found one instance of someone being seriously injured by a sawfish. They're very gentle. In fact, you can often pull them up to the boat without them even fighting very much. And in fact, that's one of the reasons they're so culturally important. Is they occur near people. They occur in very shallow water. They occur in bays, in rivers, and often in incredibly shallow water. You sometimes see them and their fins don't even stay under the water because it's so shallow. And they're so huge, and then people interact with them and they expect them to be super dangerous because they look like a crocodile or something. And they're not. They're pretty gentle and easy to catch. And so I think that this mythology has grown up in many parts of the world, that they're sacred and they're powerful because they don't act like a normal animal. They don't run away. They're not dangerous. They don't attack. They're easy to catch, even though they're huge and look really dangerous. So I think a lot of people viewed them as something more than just an animal.
Okay, we got another question from the chat box that comes from Noval. I heard that there are several countries that succeed in protecting the sawfish. Besides reduce the fishing, what other thing they do in order to protect the sawfish?
Yeah, reducing fishing is a huge thing that's very important. You also need to protect areas like we were talking about, that there's got to be areas that are completely off limits to fishing, and particularly net fishing, so that there isn't pressure on them all the time, so that their population can actually grow and expand. And you also have to teach people to value them, especially fishermen, people who would encounter them, so that they know not to kill them, that if they do catch them, to release them, whether it's a recreational fisherman or a commercial fisherman. And you can also get people on board, like the fishermen in Australia are pretty well trained and are pretty knowledgeable now about sawfish, and they know to release them, and they're coming up with their own ways of how to release them, and they're learning areas that you catch more sawfish by accident in your nets than others, and so they're learning which areas to avoid. And so just by having more knowledge about them, you can help them be safer and have people interact in that same area without damaging them as much.
Okay, another question for you, Matthew, that comes from Iis. She wonders about the climate. Is it affecting the sawfish life so far?
Not that I've heard. I mean, certainly they are temperature sensitive, and we're seeing some areas become, at least on the land, extremely hot and almost too hot for humans to live in. Like the Arabian Peninsula is becoming really, really hot, and in some areas they're speculating that people may not be able to survive there. They're going to have to move to other areas because it's just getting too hot for human habitation. And we're seeing certain areas of the ocean warm, and we've already seen corals dying in certain regions. So I haven't specifically heard of areas where sawfish are being impacted that way, but that certainly is a possibility that they are temperature sensitive and they do live in the tropics. So there certainly could be areas that become too hot for them. That's a possibility.
Okay, Matthew. So these are my personal question that many sawfish are extinct from large areas from Indonesia. What do you think about that? Is it correct so far?
I think so. I mean, I think that, I mean, we don't see everything that's caught, of course. Most fishermen don't take pictures and report it. But I do think that if I do a sample, like for instance, I've been looking at wedge fish in Indonesia and Malaysia. That's the ikan hiu kemajan, and they're critically endangered, like sawfish are. And I'm finding lots of wedge fish captures every month. And I've only seen a handful of sawfish every year, maybe. Some years I don't see anything. So that tells me that just general numbers, there are way less sawfish than there are wedge fish. And I think it's because of the saw. They just get so easily caught in nets that they disappear. And then once they're gone, the prevalence of nets for other fish keep catching them. And so they never have a chance to rebuild their population. So I think sawfishes are very rare in Indonesia, but we do see them. And we do see some, you know, in Sumatra and you know, Sarawak and Papua and such. So there are some populations there, but I think their populations are way down. It's like we were saying that it was, you know, we've probably lost 95%. We only have 5% left. And I haven't found a dwarf sawfish in that area for decades. Like I've found some records, but they're from like the 1930s or something. They're nothing recent. So I think sawfishes are largely gone from Indonesia, but we do see some. There's some remnant populations holding on, and if we can identify where those are and protect areas, we might be able to rebuild that population just like they did in Florida.
Right. We still have hope, right?
Yep, I think so. Yes.
Yeah, okay. The next question is come from Novel. Novel is sharing in the Indonesia context, it's sometimes difficult to teach the local fishermen to appreciate or to care and value the sawfish. Is there any tips to teach them about how to really appreciate the sawfish?
I think there have been successful campaigns in, for instance, Australia, where they did have resistance from some of the fishers there, but they had programs for them. They had lectures for them. They came to where they were and, you know, brought food and taught them about sawfish, and a lot of them ended up appreciating them, and they taught them how to get them out of their nets. And I think they even had some subsidies where if they did have to cut their nets, that the government would replace the net or give them some money toward it. And so that took a lot of the sting out of it, where you know, they were happy to participate. And then also you have to have laws in place that makes it illegal to hurt them, and then enforce those laws so that you know, have observers on fishing vessels sometimes, and so the fishermen know that if they do that, they risk losing their license, they risk maybe even going to jail. And I think that once you have compliance and once you have people learning about them, I think a lot of fishermen end up liking them because they obviously are interested in fish, and I think they're unique and fascinating animals, and I think a lot of people can come around to that position.
All right. Yeah, Retno is commenting that we can use the story of local folklore, such as Tuan Tugang Parangan, as an educational approach also.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. You know, this is something I talk about in all my lectures, is that it's important to make sawfishes have a cultural personality. Like, just think of like the West, Europe and America. Like, we love dolphins, but we don't really care about sharks. Why is that? It's that cultural personality, and it doesn't have to be that way. If you look at, there's an Indian culture in Panama that loves sawfish because they think sawfishes protect humans from sharks and crocodiles, and also that the sawfishes have a spirit that protect humans from sickness in the spirit world. So they love sawfish. And so you can foster that sort of cultural value in lots of different ways, but I think those sort of local stories are important. That I think that has interest. I think that's a good story, and I think, like, you know, having sawfish have some sort of cultural value in the area through art through stories, I think is really important. Like find out what they think about them in Java and in Sumatra and in Sarawak and in Papua. Like there's probably lots of different stories. As I said, I found art. I found Noxopristis saws covered with ornate silver from Madura, multiple saws that's got some sort of cultural value. I don't know if that's an amulet for fishing or I don't know what that is, but it's something interesting, you know, and that's the sort of thing that you can use when you're talking about them. Think about why do Americans love bald eagles? Because it's a symbol, you know. Why do lots of cultures in Indonesia and Malaysia like tigers? Because it's a symbol. It appears on sport logos and military logos and, you know, tribal art and all sorts of things. So it makes them important to people, and if they're important to people, they hopefully will care about them.
Awesome. Okay. Seems like we have no more questions, Matthew.
Okay.
Okay, so great. Thank you to Matthew McDavitt. It's been really informative webinar, and thank you for everyone for joining us. I think we have 67 participants so far. So we're hoping that everyone can learn something about sawfish in Indonesia, especially for you Indonesian people. In that way, we can support each other, spread the information, educate your friends, share your story, report your sawfish sighting to us or to Elasmo Brands Project Indonesia, and yeah, let's fight together side by side to save this critical endangered race that apparently still exists in our country. So for the next part, we have a Kahoot quiz. This is just a short, fun quiz to test what we've learned so far from what Matthew explained. I might ask Mbak Will's help to share the screen and ask Matthew, can you please turn off the share screen so one of my friends. Okay, Mbak Willy, are you ready? So it's a pretty quiz. It's a pretty easy quiz. You just need another device from the one that you're using from Zoom right now. So if you open the Zoom from your laptop or your computer, grab your phone or your friend's phone, go to kahoot.it and then put in the code. Willy. Jadi bagi yang online pakai Zoom-nya dari laptop, perlu HP untuk nanti bisa ikut kuisnya, atau kebalikan yang online Zoom pakai HP, buka laptopnya untuk bermain kuis, karena kita butuh device yang berbeda. Mbak Willy, I'm afraid the screen is not okay.
Can you see the screen?
All right. Okay. So go to kahoot.it and then put in the code that you see on the screen, which is 776461. You will see the questions we have prepared on the Zoom, and you should answer it with another device. You can go with your phone or your another device. Whoop, we got silver kitten so far. Let's wait for some more. Namborino, Fanny Lama. Oh, this is Ip Dragon. I can see the screen. Just make sure, is there anyone who can see the Kahoot screen on the Zoom right now?
I see it.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Okay, let's wait for some people to join. Okay, please take notice that the scoring, the final scoring, depends on how fast you're answering them, with the right answer, of course. And you have only 10 seconds to answer every question. In that way, it will be more fun. Perhaps we have to 20 seconds in some questions that's pretty difficult. So let's see. Oh, okay. Okay, I think let's wait until 25 people. 3 more. All right, that's it. Let's get started, I think. Okay, please deal with the questions while enjoy music. Willie, go for it. Start. What are the names of the poles around the cluster battery with electrical signals? Hmm, what will it be? Oh, we have 7 people like answer so far. Okay, question. Here are the Sawfish population spreads. Next step. We still got 1 people wrong answer. Okay, go silver kitten. Next question. Sawfishes are distributed to cold water area. Is it true or is it false? What do you think? Okay, next question. Silver kitten. Crocodile is one of the sawfish preys. You must get it when you see Matthew slides back then. Is it true or is it? Okay. Next question. Who is the person who riding sawfish which spreading Islam in Kalimantan on the painting? This one, I find this one really interesting. So it's really hard to forget it. Very, very easy. Oh, here still that. Sawfish trading is a legal activity in Indonesia. Perburuan sawfish itu dibenarkan. Apakah benar, apakah salah? Masih banyak yang salah ternyata, Bung. Next question. Okay. The cultural value of Papuan art states that sawfish is believed to be ada Papua percaya sawfish itu sebagai apa? This one is pretty hard. I'm a mess. Okay, only 5% got the right answer. Next question. The threat of accidental catching is referred to. Very easy. Okay, we got 10 people right answers. Ooh, persuasive. The body part of sawfish that seems like a saw clothed with. We have some terminology here. 10 people got the right answer. Okay. Next question. The main targets of sawfish threat are the rostrum and fins. Is it true or is it false? Oh, we still got 4 people in the wrong answer. Okay, next question. Sawfish Indonesia project get the support funding from. Okay, yeah, you got the funding from CLP, Conservation Leadership Program. And the final question. Matthew McDavitt affiliated with. We only got 7 people in the right answer. Okay, so the winner is Nimble Hair at the third position, Silver Kitten. And the winner is Dandy Badger. Okay, congratulations for the winner for the first and the second and the third. Congratulations, yeah. Okay, Mbak Willy, you can turn off the share screen and you can also stop the music. All right, so let's wrap this up. Once again, a huge thank you for Matthew and thank you for everyone for joining us. And before we go, can all of you turn on your video just a moment so we can take a quick photo? Can we do that? Sebelum kita sudahi, boleh tolong hidupkan kameranya dulu, lalu kita foto sebentar. If that's okay. Great, thank you. Diki, tolong di screenshot ya, Dik. Okay. Give it a pause and 1, 2, 3. Okay, slide kedua, Dik. And 1, 2, 3. All right. So once again, thank you, Matty. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And see you next time.
Terima kasih.
Ya, sama-sama, Matthew. Thank you also for Nicholas Delphi to join us today. And Jeff Witty, thank you.